You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, how are we doing?
I don't know about you, but I'm doing very well, thank you.
I mean, like as a podcast, we've been doing this for a little while.
Oh.
Is it still working?
Oh, yeah, it's still working. I'm getting tons of feedback from people that love my contribution.
Are they all named Baker?
Oh, you picked that up, huh? You picked that up.
Because yeah, okay.
Half of the podcast is doing very, very well.
I just wondered, we've been doing this for a while. I've lost track, and I don't know how many will have been gone to air by the time this one does. We've recorded a lot more. We've talked before about the idea that there's probably a limit on this thing. We're going to have to put a bullet in it at some point. I just wondered if we're getting close.
I don't think so. I will need a new partner at some point, but I'll let you know. I've only gotten like 20 requests, suggestions that way.
Yeah. Are you open to the canine variety, or is it important that it's human?
How do you feel about it? How do you feel about how it's going?
I feel like we've got like 2 or 3 more in us, and
you feel that way every month.
It's my 25th wedding anniversary next week, and my wife was saying today, I think we should do an after-action review.
Oh, now that's a good idea.
I said, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. See if it makes sense to keep going. I said, we should just commit to like 25-year blocks and just not, let's not get carried away.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a few more in us, right? Let's keep going.
Okay.
And when it's done, are we going to know it's done, or are we going to just keep going long after we should have hung it up?
If we look at the stats, we'll know it's done.
Yeah. Okay.
If we look at the download stats, yeah.
Okay. Today we're going to talk about the science of structuring roles. I'm going to interview you on this, and I propose this one to you because of all of the work that you do. This is among the most fascinating to me. I think you're probably the only person who's really gone in and mapped out all of the different roles in a kind of a standard independent creative firm. And then you've applied all kinds of science against how those roles should be structured. And in some of the roles, what the profiles of success looks like. Now, have I kind of summed that up accurately?
Yeah, exactly. And it also includes like which ones the principals shouldn't be doing, which ones they should be doing, how much of each role is necessary, what are the dangerous combinations. So it sort of unfolded accidentally years ago, and I've just kept adding to it over the years. It's been really fun. I love the science part of things. So when I can move beyond just instinct and quantify some element of what I do, it's I love that. And this is an example of that.
So I'm looking at this beautiful diagram. It's called the Recourses Functional Model.
You can charge more if you call it something.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the science behind this, and then I want to ask you about. I want to go role by role about the 12 different roles. I want to hear which ones can the principal let go of, and which ones can they not. Where's their tension, or what maybe the problem roles are. But just let's begin with the science behind it. How long have you been collecting data? How much data do you have? And
Sure. So I started advising clients or victims. They were more victims at the time in 94. And about 4 years into that process, I was sitting down one day and I noticed that I was making similar recommendations to what I had recommended, similar to what I recommended the week before. And it really just jarred me. And I thought, well, first of all, am I just being lazy? Or then I realized, no, I'm starting to see some patterns here. And that was when I started to take this whole pattern matching thing seriously. So I decided to name the functions, but to use nondescript or non-loaded terms. So I didn't want to call anybody an account executive because some people hate account executives. Some people have no problem with them. So I just named it something else and went through all the roles that way. And then just started to make observations about what were safe or unsafe combinations. And the first one that came up, I'm sure you've noticed this, is that even though the skills for managing an account are very similar to new business skills, it's pretty dangerous to combine the two because the client work is always more urgent. And so it's not more important, but it's more urgent. So it pushes out the sales stuff. So we have to be particularly careful if the same person happens to be doing both. So that was just one observation and made tons of other observations. The next step was to figure out how much of each function was necessary because I was getting these calls from principals saying, hey, the accounting people are whining and they say they need more help. And if they really do need more help, I'm glad to give it to them. But how much accounting do we need at a firm like ours? And so I calculated that. And that began the process of calculating that same thing for all the different roles. That prompted me to go to the next stage, and it just kind of like this Pandora's box, honestly, because some firms, like in-house departments, for instance, which I was working with back then, didn't have three functions. They didn't do their own accounting, they didn't have their own IT, and they didn't have business development because they had a built-in client. So all of those ratios were a little bit different. And then fast forwarding to the place where roles were happening. And I was just curious to find some other way for principals to be able to make better hiring decisions. And I tried all kinds of things. We ought to talk about this someday. I tried intelligence testing. That was a disaster. I went on and tried a bunch of things and finally landed on personality profiles. And I was doing a seminar for creative directors. There was 50 of them coming for 2 days in San Francisco. And I thought, I've got all these people here. I'll just give them all a personality profile and see what it shows. Well, there was no pattern whatsoever, and I almost gave up. But I noticed that I had another event coming up in 6 weeks for account executives, and so I gave them all a personality profile, and the similarity between them was just staggering, and that's what pushed me in the direction of spending, more than $300,000 over the years. So 14,000 people initially, and another 9, so 23,000 people have gone through this study. Each one of them had three things. They had that personality profile. They had a 30-minute interview from me, face-to-face, in person. And then they did a 25-question qualitative, quantitative survey. So that's the background, and that's where all the data comes from.
That's a ton of data. Wow.
I'm tired just thinking about it, honestly.
I'm doing the math on how many years of your life you spent interviewing people, but it was all part of your consulting engagements, I imagine.
Right. Yep. I should have stopped interviewing people way before that. It was too much. They say, how many people do you need to interview when you're trying to figure something out at a company? And basically the flip answer is when you quit learning things. And I should have quit earlier, but it's pretty interesting. There's still so much in there that I haven't even explored, that I have digitally, that I need to analyze at some point.
Let's get into the roles. Where do you want to start? Should we start with, is there a role for owner?
There is. I call that directing. Again, I use sort of non-loaded language.
Yeah.
So there's 12 roles altogether, and there are 3 of those roles that the principal must always do. In other words, they cannot safely delegate these 3 roles. So you can envision a 1,000-person firm with just one principal, and it could thrive as long as the principal is touching these 3 roles. And so one of them is running the firm. That's directing. That's deciding about the culture, about the positioning, looking at the financial performance and so on, all of those things that a principal can only do. Second is deciding on what the positioning should be and revisiting that however frequently they need to. And then third, and this doesn't take much time, but just showing up at some point when you're closing really massive accounts. And as long as the principal's doing those 3 things, then the firm can thrive. There's no problem at all. And a lot of principals think they're more important than that. And of course, in a smaller firm, they can do a lot more than that, obviously. Like I'm a one-man shop and I do all 12 roles. But if I were going to have a lot of employees, if I decided to go down that path, as long as I'm still doing those 3 things, the firm is not at any disadvantage.
Yeah. So you mentioned 3 roles that the principal cannot let go of, or at least completely: directing, positioning, and closing. And as you mentioned, sometimes their involvement in closing is just cursory. So the idea is you've got somebody starts a new business. Maybe it's a design firm, and that person is effectively wearing, we like to say we're wearing many hats, but you're saying, according to the Recourse's functional model, they're effectively wearing 12 hats. And as they hire people, they start to hand off hats. And you're saying the last three hats that they do not hand off are directing, positioning, and closing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so let's moving away from the principals, and I don't know if there's one that you can identify as the first one that should be handed off, the first hire, but let's just think in
Sure.
that order. What roles does the principal begin to staff for?
So the first one that they would give up is what I call resourcing, and that's the basically the control tower, the information control tower of the firm around projects. It's project management. I call it resourcing. And for years, I used to say, all right, Mr. or Mrs. Principal, you got to give this up. And they would say, oh, I have. That's not a problem. I've already done that. And I just think, no, you haven't. You're still doing it.
You've got to really give it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm serious. And so I had to come up with a simple question that enabled them to see whether or not they had given up these three roles that we're going to talk about next. And so this first one, the question was, all right, if you bump into somebody at some social event, just by accident, you bump into a client and the client's talking, you each have a drink in your hand and they say, oh, by the way, what's the status of such and such? You, as the principal, should never be able to answer that question without consulting somebody else first. That's
such and such being a project of the clients that your firm is working on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you know the status of something, then you're too close to it and you haven't given this up. So when the firm grows, you give this up first. The reason you give it up first is because it's the least expensive to replace, because if something goes bad, it doesn't put any of your client relationships at risk like some of the others. And, there's some other reasons, but that's the first one you give up.
Okay. So resourcing is the first one. What's the profile of a successful resourcer?
So that one I'll kind of hold close to my vest, but I will say that this is there's only 5 roles of the 12 where there is some degree of personality profile match, and there are different degrees of match. So on the 4 personality profile axes, like with the principal, there's only a match on 1 of them. With account service on 2, with accounting on 3, resourcing there's 4. So there's only 5 roles where there's any degree of personality profile match out of the 12 roles, and there's only 1 of those 5 where we're looking for something so specific that on every one of the 4 axes, this person needs to be in a certain place.
It makes it sound like this is a pivotal role, and in fact, in the model, it's kind of right at the center of the model.
It is, yeah. It actually is, and it relates so much to client experience and profitability and quality. It's like it really is the control tower of the firm. It's so critical to get this one right. So you're looking at somebody's personality. You're looking at somebody and saying, could they be a great resourcing fit? And so you look at the personality profile. Now, just because the profile is a match doesn't mean they're going to be a great resourcing person. But if they are not a match, then they're going to struggle. They could be effectively doing this job over time, but they're going to revert to who they naturally are when they're tired or mad, and it's going to take just so much energy out of them. So yeah, it's a very close match, and it's one of the most important. I think it's the most important role at a firm. I think account service is the most difficult role, but I think this is the most important role of a firm.
I think of the first ad agency that I worked for. I was 22 years old, and the person who really ran that firm made everything happen. Everything flowed through her. Her title was production manager.
Yeah,
and
back then.
It was the flow of jobs. It was the assignment of people to jobs. It was costing. So there may be a few different, or even price setting. There may be a few different kind of roles wrapped up in who this person was, but she didn't have the most seniority. She wasn't, but she was kind of the person behind the scenes who really threw most of the levers. Is that a resourcing person, or are we talking about a different role?
Yep, that's exactly right. It's sort of like make the trains run on time, and that's lower on the totem pole of what they do. But, at the very top, they're responsible for objective pricing because they're driven by objectivity, to use that word again. They're not driven by what a client wants to see or what a client says they can pay. It's really driven by objectivity. So, yeah, they're absolutely critical to a firm.
Yeah, and is that the person where there's often some tension between that person and others in the firm?
Yeah, exactly. That I don't hear this anymore, but back then the joke was always, the consultants used to use the same joke. It was like, if you like your production manager or your resourcing person or whatever, we don't use production manager anymore because the world has changed so much. But if you like your X, then you have the wrong one. That was the joke, because they were a little bit bristly, and that's also why principals have so much difficulty hiring for this role, because principals have this. They're very sensitive to somebody who's not deferential by nature, and these people are not deferential by nature, and so they'll often skip over somebody who would make a perfect resourcer because they're not deferential.
Yeah, they see themselves as, quite rightly, I think, as a pragmatist in an environment where sometimes a lot of people, including the people at the top, are a little bit unrealistic at times about deadlines, about budgets, about what price should be. I think of them as, in a lot of firms, as the defenders of the margin. The account person who wants to sell something comes back with the price, and this person says, no, that's going to be close to cost. You need to go get 50% more. And he or she doesn't really care. That person isn't on the front lines with the client, but they have a sense of how everything works and the resources required to pull off the commitment that the salesperson, the account person, is proposing to make. So they're a lot more realistic, and I think that's so I can see the tension. I've seen it in firms I've worked in. I can see it in my clients' firms. And I think for the most part, and I think that's what you're saying, that's a healthy tension, and you shouldn't look to ease that tension. It's there for a reason. It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's the kind of healthy tension that holds bridges up. It's not the kind of tension where you're not speaking with your spouse. That's unhealthy tension, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I was just smiling to myself as you were talking, because the first word out of this person's mouth is usually no.
Yeah.
And
one of my favorite words.
Yeah. And, the first word out of a account service person's mouth is yes. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's the healthy tension between the two.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker of Recourses, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
Okay, where are we going from resourcing?
Okay, so the second role that they've got to give up would be managing accounts. And using the same premise that we need to have one question to keep principals honest. It's like, if I sat down as an outsider with every one of your clients and said, give me the name of your day-to-day contact. As I go around the list with all the clients, none of them should give me your name. If that's the case, then you've given that up. And again, there is a very specific profile this person has, and you hire somebody with that profile. Just because they have that profile doesn't mean they're a good fit, but that's a great place to start.
Okay. And what do you call that role?
I call it engaging. I don't really like that word all that much because I don't know. I'm still searching for a better word, but engaging. I've thought about changing that to leading, because I think that, especially you talk a lot about how these folks, they're not order takers, they're leading the relationship. You've talked a lot about that over the years, and that's made me think maybe I should rename this to leading, without giving you any credit for that, of course.
Of course, yes. Or it could be facilitating or something else.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's engaging. You said it's one of the most difficult ones, but maybe not one of the most vital ones. Not as vital as resourcing.
Yeah, exactly. Difficult because they have a leg firmly planted on both sides of the fence, right? And they're really an ambassador. That sometimes they're fighting for the client, other times they're fighting for their employer. I am just amazed at the skill that comes with being a great client interface person. Not the most important, but the most difficult job at the firm, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so far we've covered directing, positioning, closing, and those three are the roles that the principal cannot give up, at least completely.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then we've talked about resourcing and engaging.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go to the third one after that.
The third one, and most firms don't need to give this up because it can be done pretty easily and almost on a part-time basis, but that's managing the people doing most of the work. So they, at some point, need to put a layer between them and the people doing most of the work. That comes as the firm grows, and there are tipping points. Certain, like as you add bodies, you invoke the next change as you climb up that employee count, and this would be the last one that you would give up. What's unique about these three things that you have to give up is that they require full-time access. They also require you to be, on site all the time. So that's what wears out principals. It's like being on call all the time. It's the most unsustainable part of their job. I think of it as like, for anybody that's had young kids, even though there's not enormous physical requirements, like the kid only weighs, 8 pounds at birth and then up to 30 later or whatever, it's not that. It's more just the notion of being on call all the time. All these three jobs require somebody to be on call, and that's what makes a principal's role unsustainable unless they give these up over time.
And sorry, what's the name of the role that you
I
just
call
talked
that
about?
one shaping.
Shaping.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first three roles that the principal wants to give up in order are resourcing, engaging, and shaping.
Yes.
And is there a profile for shapers?
There's not, actually. There's no profile for that one.
Okay, where do we go from shaping?
So we've talked about three that they have to give up, three that they have to keep. That leaves six. And so if you're thinking about, and this all gets fairly complicated, you have to write all this stuff out. What I do in actual consulting with firms through the total business review process, that's the only way I basically deliver this, is I'll actually make a specific recommendation for every single individual, then talk about what's going to happen over the next 18 months, and then the long-term plan 4 to 5 years from now. And part of that means like, okay, what's the principal going to do very specifically at this firm because of how many principals there are in the partnership and how big the firm is and what their particular strengths are. So let's say they've given up these three things they should and they're retained these other three things and they've still got time on their hands. What do we want to do with that? Then, we've got to answer that question. Usually we would think about maybe strategy, or maybe it's creative direction, or maybe it's on the ground doing new business development besides just the positioning and the closing, but all the stuff in between, all the lead generation activities. So we have to take into account what somebody really wants to do in that process. And then we also have to think about how do this resourcing and engaging, how do those two things come together? You were talking earlier about how there has to be a healthy tension between these two. I call that sort of the center of tension, and the easy way to divine basically where the center of tension is to think about the perspective through the eyes of the account person. Who is the account person afraid of? Is the account person at your firm more afraid of resourcing or are they more afraid of the client? And I actually picture a real situation. So I picture the account person off-site at the clients, and the client is telling them what needs to happen, and the account person is nodding, saying, yep, no problem. And if they're not afraid of the resourcing person, that's exactly what happens. But at some point, if there's a healthy fear, they say, got it. Okay, I need to check with resourcing, whoever that is, and we'll get back to you right away. And I developed this system. It has like 26 steps in it. One of those steps is that all promises made by the account people need to be delayed, centralized, and remote. And just that one out of those 26 different principles comes from deep research into used car salespeople and how they gather power in the car dealership. And so anyway, it's pretty involved, but it all makes sense as a system.
How decision making is removed from the front line. So the car salesman will take your offer or your counter offer and say, well, let me bring it back to my boss. And they don't have the authority to actually accept the price that you've offered.
Yeah. In fact, they'll say the offer is so ridiculous. It's like, I got to run this all the way up to Flag. I'm not sure they're even doing that. They're probably just getting another donut, right?
Sometimes they just go into the back room, and I know this. I worked in automotive advertising for 6 years. Sometimes they just go back in the back room, tell the sales manager what's going on, put their feet up, read a magazine for a few minutes,
make you sweat,
and then go back out and with orders, go get $500 more, $2,000 more, or whatever. It's actually quite a fun game as long as you're not the one on the front lines.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so we're trying to think of the principals kept 3 things, given up 3 things, and now there's 6 roles left, and we need to figure out which of these roles does it make sense for the principal, if any, to keep that person busy. Do you want to name those 6, and then we'll dive into the ones where it makes sense to dive in?
Yeah, so the 6 that we haven't really addressed yet would be, I call it attracting, and that's just the whole implementing the lead generation side of things. Another would be planning, and that's just a nod to the fact that we really call it account planning, something that was created in the UK in the 50s and 60s.
So would another term for that be strategy, setting the strategic direction for their clients?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then another one would be what I call developing, which is the front line, the doing folks, the coders, the writers, the designers, the UX people.
The people making the sausages.
The people really doing the work rather than the rest of us just sitting around watching them do the work. Yep.
Yeah.
And then another one would be measuring. So that's the financial, the CFO, the accounting side of things. Another would be facilitating, which is just my term for the IT function. And finally, just supporting, which is just the admin support. But the admin support is usually focused in 3 areas. It supports business development, it supports project management, and it supports accounting. And so those are the other 6 roles. So some of them obviously wouldn't, although, I was just going to say, obviously the principal wouldn't do that, but I'm not sure that's really true. I do all 12 of these roles. So the huge downside of not having employees is you have to do all of these things, right? But if you have employees, you want to use your time well. So as I mentioned earlier, that it's pretty easy to eliminate some of these. So if a principal's got extra time, they're doing everything the way they should, not doing things they shouldn't, then usually we focus on one or more of either business development, planning, or creative direction. Those are usually the ones that make the most sense, those 3.
Gotcha. You got to give that person something to do.
Right. Or they'll muck up everything, right? Keep them busy.
I think we've, I don't want to assume anything here, but I think we talked about you said the hardest role to fill is resourcing. You said engaging or account management, account services. That's a difficult one to do, but it's not necessarily a hard one to fill. What are the other, where are the surprises in here? We all listen to this, and I think if we own a firm or we have a management position in the firm, we can identify with every one of these. We can think of the people that we have or have had or we're hoping to put into that role. And you have talked about some surprises, but what else haven't we talked about here? Things where you just never expected that you were going to learn that somebody who does measuring, it was really important that they have red hair or whatever it is that your research has uncovered.
Yeah. One thing that's a little surprising, but mainly amusing to me when you look back over the history of roles in the marketing field is that most of the big changes in how we've looked at these roles have been a reaction to try and tamp down the power that account people have taken. And it's really true when you start to think about that. Most movements in history around roles in the marketing field have been to put account people back in their place. They are so good at what they do that they amass power. And so one of the first ones that came into play was basically, this whole project management feature, because they were not being objective about pricing. They were waiting too long till the end to get things done. And really, some of the best account people usually have to have resourcing people sort of following around behind them, like with doggy scoops, to clean up the messes from the promises they're making. That was one. Another was separating business development, because for decades, there was not a separate business development function. And that one wasn't so much about power. It was about the fact that a new person that you hired to do sales would be effective, and then they would get all involved in keeping the client happy, the new client happy, that they would not go back, like you talk about, leaving the cave, killing something, dragging it back. So that was another one. The planning one was the third in the 50s and 60s, because account people were making so much shit up that they decided they needed to have a separate function that was a strategy function to keep account people honest. That is why account planning started. It was to pull power away from account people who'd gathered power again. And I don't know where they're going to sneak up on us next in history, this fourth generation, but it's going to happen at some point, and we will be there to smack them on the head.
As a former account person, I'm just grinning broadly. And I've counseled so many clients who have had really good, as in effective account people, just amass so much power that the principal could not sleep at night. So it is a recurring problem, right?
Yeah, right. And then you can't fire them. You can't shape their behavior. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, this is great. I love this model. I've loved it for years. I love listening to you talk about it. I'm really impressed by the amount of research that you have underpinning it, the patterns. What I didn't realize until today is that you have these key questions, one question that you can ask the principal to determine if they really have let go of this function. Yeah. I think that's really powerful too. I want to close by asking something that I was thinking throughout as we're going through this, is the fact that creative firms, especially via technology, but in other ways, creative firms have changed over the years, and we have roles. I mentioned a production manager. That's not a term you hear much anymore. And so, how have the changing roles and tools of the creative firm over the years impacted your model? Have you had to go back and tweak, or do you find that it holds up over time?
Yeah, I have had to change things a lot. Like when development shops showed up, it really threw me for a loop, because the relative mix of roles was very different. And so how much account service and how much project management, those were actually reversed, flipped on their head. So I've had to redo the model and actually have a specific application for digital firms. So that's one. The other, I'm sure you've noticed this as well, it used to be so common that you had to hire a salesperson with a very specific personality. Those days are gone. You could have somebody who's a great writer and doesn't necessarily have the same personality like everybody else does. So that's one thing that's changed. I would say there's another change coming. Actually, I need to catch up with myself here too, and that's that the whole IT function is largely not separate anymore. So that's another change. It's actually been fun. The fact that it's not static has kept me really on my toes, and I've enjoyed seeing where those changes come.
Thanks, David. This has been fantastic.
Thanks, Blair.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.